In the shadows of ancient Rome, a wedding night was often more of a crime scene than a celebration. For an enslaved bride, the bedroom was a courtroom where her body was treated as mere evidence. What masters and husbands demanded behind closed doors was a ritual of power that was, in every sense, worse than any punishment. Imagine a young woman in a flame-colored veil, led by her mother through a procession of torches and rough songs, thinking tonight will be a promise kept between two people. The atrium smells of oil and roasted nuts, neighbors clap rhythmically, and a pronuba, an older woman trained to shepherd brides, guides her into the dim inner chamber where celebration turns, abruptly and irrevocably, into evidence. That change is the heart of what we are about to examine: how a society turned intimacy into proof, how legal rituals could treat a woman's body as document and property, and why the historical record is full of silences where there should be testimony. If the hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Livia Tirsa is not a historical celebrity with a preserved voice. She is a composite, drawn from names and narratives that survive in fragments, a young woman representative of countless others, whose emotions and memories are absent from surviving texts. On the night of her wedding, she feels the hands of the pronuba, hears her mother's breath tremble, senses the practical ritual that will follow the spectacle. A wooden phallic figure, known in Roman sources as mutunus tutinus, might be present in the courtyard or nearby shrine. The communal songs, the display of nuts on the threshold, the ceremonial placement of the bride on a special seat. These are not mere theatrics. They are the prelude to a legal procedure designed to create a record that could be summoned decades later in disputes about inheritance, legitimacy, and status. To a modern ear, this can sound monstrous, and with good reason. The Roman concern was not primarily about the couple's feelings. It was about family lines, property, and the precise allocation of rights that hinged on whether a bride was considered to have consummated her marriage as a free-born wife. In Roman legal thought, marriage often involved the transfer of a woman from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband, a condition called manus. Once in manus, a woman's legal capacity was reshaped. She was no longer simply a daughter with a household of origin, but a person whose reproductive potential had direct bearing on property transmission. Verification, literal, witnessed verification, was the way the community converted an intimate act into a juridical fact. The ritual apparatus that enacted that conversion had several actors: the pronuba, whose role was to ensure that the bride executed the formal actions; witnesses from the household and neighborhood; and sometimes a physician or midwife, whose observations could be framed as expertise. Ancient commentators and later critics, Varro, Augustine, Arnobius, Lactantius among them, describe or denounce these customs in ways that make clear the ritual's dual nature: sacred performance and juridical instrument. Medical writers, when they broach the subject, do so with a clinical voice, discussing signs, tissues, and what could be taken as proof. But the sources are patchy, sometimes embarrassed, and often hostile. That embarrassment has a way of shaping what survives. What we reconstruct is therefore always partial, a mosaic of fragments, some clear, many inferred. The core of the ritual was forensic, not romantic. What needed to be recorded was not only that sex happened, but that it occurred in a way that confirmed the woman's status as a freeborn bride who could produce legitimate heirs. That meant witnesses and a procedure that created observable marks, a testimony to be brought before judges or family councils years later. The pronuba's grip, the chanting neighbors, the sight of the bride in a particular garment, and the subsequent examination by a medical authority were all means to the same end: a community-generated proof intended to outlast the bodies it documented. Descriptions of the more theatrical moments, symbolic contact with the mutunus tutinus, the draping and uncovering, appear in literature and satirical sources with varying levels of detail and scorn. These are not pornographic fragments. They are civic rituals with ritualized gestures. Some ancient writers treat them as embarrassing vestiges of a lewd past. Some legal texts take them as necessary formalities. The historian must treat these sources with care. Where texts are vivid, those details can be reported. Where texts are evasive or contradictory, the correct stance is caution, and that caution is what we will exercise here. When specifics are absent or disputed, I will mark them indefinido. What happened after the public spectacle, in more private settings, is where the procedure becomes clinical and the legal logic transparent. A physician or midwife might be called to inspect the bride. This was not an examination aimed at diagnosis in the way we understand medicine. It was an inspection that could be converted into testimony. Observations might be recorded, whether there was blood on a garment, whether a hymen was intact according to prevailing medical ideas, or whether signs of consummation could be identified. Such observations served as the material counterpart to oral witness statements. In legal disputes about the legitimacy of heirs, such material and testimonial evidence could decide fortunes. There is an unavoidable broken silence at the center of these sources, the women themselves. The surviving texts record what men, legists, moralists, satirists, physicians, wrote, not what brides remembered. So we must listen for the indirect traces. The trembling hand of a mother recorded by a satire, the acidic disapproval in Augustine's rhetoric, the clinical detachment of a medical manual. From those traces, we can reconstruct the social pressure, the humiliation, and the erosion of agency that accompanied rituals meant to produce certainty for others at the expense of a woman's autonomy. A crucial point often elided in simplified retellings is that the rituals served multiple audiences. They reassured the husband's family that heirs would be undisputed. They provided magistrates and courts with a form of demonstrable proof. They acted as a public performance that reinforced the community's moral economy. A bride's body became a site where competing claims, familial, legal, economic, were settled in a way that made bodily intimacy legible to tribunals and kinship networks. That legibility was not neutral. It was embedded in a political and economic system that prioritized male lineage and property. This legalizing of intimacy has an important analog that the title of this piece foregrounds: the treatment of enslaved women. Rome had a large population of enslaved people whose legal status was starkly different from that of freeborn women. Slaves were property under Roman law. Their bodies and labor could be bought, sold, and controlled by their masters. In some households, enslaved women might be compelled into sexual acts by masters, or married in arrangements that blurred categories between formal marriage and enforced concubinage. The documentary record that explicitly describes masters conducting ritualized wedding night verifications on enslaved women is thin to non-existent. To assert such a practice as routine would be to overstep the surviving evidence. For claims connecting the specific wedding night verifications discussed above to enslaved women's experience, the correct label is indefinido. That said, it is not speculative to say that the property logic underpinning Manus and the legal status of slaves created environments in which control over a woman's sexuality and reproductive capacity was exercised by others as part of property relations. If a wife under Manus could be treated legally as under another person's authority, her father or husband, the conceptual leap to discuss enslaved women's vulnerability to masters' sexual power is analytically coherent. But whether masters routinely staged formal, witnessed examinations for enslaved women in the same juridical manner reserved for freeborn brides is not something the sources allow us to assert with confidence. There is, again, a necessary distinction between plausible inference and documented fact. Where I suggest parallels or likely overlaps, I will flag them as interpretive, and where evidence exists, I will rely on it directly. Understanding manuscripts and legal logic helps clarify why communities invested time and ritual energy in producing physical proof. Roman property disputes were technical, protracted, and consequential. Land, dowries, succession, these were the domain of cold calculation, even when justified in warm familial rhetoric. In that environment, oral testimony could be contested. A material trace, blood on a garment, a midwife's note, witnesses' recollections, could tip the scales. The act of witnessing itself was powerful. Communal observation conferred public facthood. Where an intimate act could be observed and recorded by persons recognized by the community, it was more likely to retain authority in court decades later. The entire ceremony, therefore, was less about the couple and more about the community's ability to produce a durable truth. Medical competence played a paradoxical role. On the one hand, physicians and midwives acted as experts whose words could be marshaled for legal ends. On the other hand, their authority was partial and culturally conditioned. Ancient medical understanding of female anatomy was imperfect and intertwined with social prejudices. What counted as conclusive evidence of virginity or consummation in one era or by one practitioner might be questioned by another. That variability is reflected in the sources. Some medical writings give relatively detailed criteria for signs. Other texts treat such knowledge cautiously or with disdain. The historian must therefore resist converting these measures into modern certainties. The value of the physician's testimony was often less about objective truth than about social recognition. A respected practitioner's words could be accepted in court because the community trusted their social authority. If this ritualized verification seems to modernize like a form of forensic politics, that is because it was. Laws and customs were engineered to regulate lineage and to make family structures legible to legal institutions. Rituals and medical testimony were tools in that arsenal. Yet it is also important to remember that these practices did not have the same meaning in all contexts or at all times. Roman custom evolved, local practices differed, and elite rhetoric did not always match popular behavior. The reaction from early Christian thinkers is instructive for both the emotional tone of the surviving record and for understanding how later cultural shifts altered which practices were visible to posterity. Augustine and other Christian writers often treat these rites with scorn, interpreting them as evidence of pagan licentiousness or as morally compromised vestiges. Their denunciations are not neutral historical descriptions, they are polemical. Yet they contribute to the disappearance of certain rituals from the public record because Christian communities, with different ideals about marital privacy and bodily modesty, were less likely to preserve or replicate public ceremonies that made sex a community spectacle. Over time, as Christian norms replaced or reshaped older customs, some practices were suppressed, some transformed, and some simply faded into obscurity. That process of erasure leaves historians with a distorted mirror. We see the fragments that critics chose to keep visible, and we must infer the rest. The silence of women in the sources compounds the problem. Where a male jurist could confidently record the legal import of an act, a woman's interiority, her shame, her fear, her resilience, goes largely unrecorded. But silence is not absence of experience. It is a problem that historians try to confront by reading what is left with care. An acerbic line in a moralist's work that reveals social disdain. A passing practical note in a medical manual that hints at a routine arrangement. A lawsuit that survives because a family contested an inheritance. Together, these fragments allow us to assemble plausible narratives about how these rituals worked and what they meant for the people subjected to them. There is moral urgency in reconstructing these practices not to indict ancient people by modern standards, but to locate patterns of social power that have long consequences. The legal mechanics that turned bodies into documents were not neutral instruments of social stability. They were mechanisms that placed women's sexuality under surveillance and control. The emotional aftermath, humiliation, enforced silence, reputational damage, disappears from court records but would have endured in households. For women like our composite Livia, the communal production of legal truth could become a form of dehumanization precisely because it reduced a complex person to a set of observable, documentable signs. To return to the question the title poses, what masters did to enslaved women on forbidden wedding nights was worse than punishment. Let us be precise about what we know and what remains speculative. The Roman legal system granted masters power over slaves that included the control of movement, labor, and often bodily autonomy. Sexual access to enslaved women by their masters is well attested in legal and literary sources. It formed part of the broader reality of slavery. Whether masters engaged in ritualized, witnessed verifications resembling the formal processes used for freeborn brides is indefinito in the documentary record. The analogy is compelling at an analytical level. Both the manus system and slave ownership rested on property logics that commodified women's reproductive capacities. But documentary evidence for identical ceremonies applied uniformly to enslaved women is not available. Where the parallel is clearer is in the outcome, rather than the rituals themselves. The master's control could be more absolute. There were fewer legal protections, fewer witnesses withstanding to contest abuses, and little recourse for enslaved women. If a master decided that an enslaved woman's child would be his property, or that her body would serve his purposes, the legal system provided him with instruments to enforce that decision. That enforcement could be a form of ongoing violation that, in its consequences, resembled or exceeded the humiliation inflicted by ritualized verification performed in the name of family honor. Because the law made slaves property, masters could impose sexual demands without the need for theatrical proof. The humiliation could be continuous and unrecorded, which in many ways made it more devastating because it eluded the public checks that ritual, flawed as it was, at least nominally provided. Interpreting this difference matters. A public ritual that turns intimacy into evidence is humiliating and legally instrumental, but it exists within a social script that gives some visibility to the act. Coercion in the private spaces of a household, especially when enacted by a master upon an enslaved woman, could be more insidious precisely because it bypassed the very mechanisms that could generate public accountability. In either case, the root problem is the same. social institutions that place the authority to determine and document another person's reproductive capacity in the hands of others. How did these practices vanish from common memory? Part of the answer lies in the sweep of cultural change during and after the Christianization of the Roman world. Christian commentators condemned what they saw as pagan indecency, and in doing so they sometimes preserved the most sensational examples while erasing the ritual context that made them intelligible. Simultaneously, Christian ideas about marriage, emphasizing spiritual union and private fidelity, shifted expectations about what belonged in public ritual. Practices that had functioned as legal evidence-making devices were no longer culturally acceptable, and over centuries the rituals changed or dissolved. Legislative reforms, shifting domestic arrangements, and the evolving role of clerical marriage rites reconfigured the social frameworks that once required public verification. There is also a historiographical dimension to the disappearance. The historians and antiquarians who compiled texts later in the medieval period had different interests. They copied what they found useful, sometimes discarding material deemed obscene or irrelevant. Physical artifacts, too, were lost or repurposed, shrines dismantled, wooden idols burned, leaving fewer traces for archaeologists. The net result is a body of evidence that is both biased and broken, requiring modern scholars to work with fragments and to be candid about the limits of reconstruction. We should also consider the affective dimension more closely. For a bride like Livia, the night's proceedings would likely produce a complex emotional landscape: exhilaration at social recognition, dread at the loss of privacy, shame or anger at being made into evidence. For enslaved women, the emotional load might include fear, compounded by the knowledge that protest could invite punishment, sale, or worse. Because silence is the prevailing archival feature, historians must allow for grief and anger as plausible dimensions of experience even when the texts do not name them. The story of these rituals raises broader questions about how societies translate private life into public fact. When does the community have the right to witness intimate acts, and for what purposes? If the answer rests on property and lineage, whose interests does the public serve, and at what human cost? These questions have resonance beyond antiquity. Debates about surveillance, bodily autonomy, and the legal regulation of sexual life are not modern inventions. They are part of a deep human conversation about power, evidence, and dignity. To be clear about methodology, when I have described specific ceremonial elements, wooden idols, the pronuba, the calling of a midwife, I have relied on the corpus of Roman legal, medical, and literary texts that mention these features. When I link those practices to the experiences of enslaved women, I mark the connection interpretive and, where evidence is absent or contradictory, indefinito. This distinction between the documented and the speculative is not an academic hair-splitting. It is essential ethical practice when dealing with lives rendered voiceless by history. What, then, should we take away from this examination? First, that the legal and ritual mechanisms of ancient Rome instrumentalized the female body in ways that served property regimes and reinforced patriarchal control. Second, that enslaved women occupied a precarious zone where such instrumentality could be more total and less accountable. Third, that the disappearance of certain rituals from the record owes as much to cultural transformation as to conscious suppression by later moralists. Finally, that reconstructing these histories requires a moral imagination that honors invisible victims without inventing evidence. Remember Livia as a composite, but also as a representative. Her veil hides not only a face, but the machinery that will render her intimate life legible to others. Remember, too, the unnamed enslaved women whose experiences do not survive in neat legal casebooks, but whose vulnerability was a structural feature of household and property regimes. To speak of them is not merely to catalog injustice. It is to restore, as far as evidence allows, a human story to the legal artifacts and moralisms that have outlived their subjects. If this account unsettled you, share the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and tell us which forgotten ritual you'd like explored next.